So some people are concerned that whether aligning full alignment to IFRS can address some of these industry-specific issues, right? I mentioned Sharia just for example, right? Any particular comment on how the IASB are staying abreast of all these industry-specific?
Yes, and that's a great question. But I would like to reassure listeners that the IASB only works in consultation with national standard setters, with the professional bodies, with stakeholders globally. And we have a lot of focus and work on our relationships with different countries. So as you know, myself, I'm part of a group of people that come from the Asia-Oceania region. We have other board members that also represent the Asia-Oceania region. But all our board members are active either through specific consultation groups or directly by visiting and engaging.
Selamat datang di acara IAI Podcast Ikatan Akuntan Indonesia. Pada kesempatan kali ini, kita diberi kesempatan untuk berbincang-bincang dengan seorang tamu yang sangat istimewa, Profesor Ann Tarca. Beliau adalah anggota dari International Accounting Standards Board. Professor Ann, welcome.
Thank you, Irwan. It's a great pleasure to be here.
We are delighted to have you here. So maybe I will introduce Professor Ann quickly and I'll let her introduce herself as well. Professor Ann is the current member of the IASB since 2017. So we in Indonesia as IAI are very delighted to host you in this podcast. Can you say a few words about yourself?
Certainly. I've been a member of the IASB since 2017, and IASB members are based in London, so that's where I live now. And prior to that, I was a professor of accounting at the University of Western Australia and head of the Accounting and Finance Discipline Group. And during those years, I used to teach IFRS Accounting Standards to many, many students and also conduct research on IFRS issues. I was also a member of the Australian Accounting Standards Board, and so very, very pleased to be here today.
So you've been a member of Australian Accounting Standards Boards prior to the IASB,
yes.
And now my understanding is this is your second term with the IASB, so
yes.
You have a long, proven track record of standard setting.
Yes, it's really important for the IASB to have the input from different countries, from the professional bodies, from the standard setting boards. And so I was very privileged to work on the Australian Accounting Standards Board and have that background, which complemented what I'd been doing with my academic research. And then to have the chance to go to London and sit at that board table and see things from a different perspective.
Wow, great. So maybe this is a good time to ask you, for our audience, adalah Akuntan di Indonesia. Can you give us a brief overview of what the IASB is doing and about the IFRS in general?
Yes, certainly. And hello to all Akuntan di Indonesia. So the IFRS accounting standards give a global language for accounting. And that's been emerging now. So the IASB for 20 years, but we know prior to that, a good 30 years of cooperative work across countries, leading to the IASC. So very much demand-driven, with people wanting a global language that could be used for cross-border investment. So that underpins the initial push to harmonisation, and many of us were involved in that. I know Australia had a harmonisation initiative at the same time, and so did Indonesia. That was my initial research work, looking at Australia and Indonesia from about 1996 onwards. Yeah. So it's a long history, but it responds to market demands. It responds to investors wanting comparable information. So I think the accounting profession has been absolute leaders in global cooperation, and that's driven by the technology and by the demands. So, the global capital market is operating 24 hours a day, and money is going to go where they can get the best returns.
Yeah.
Now, to get those best returns, the efficiency that people are looking for means that the investors can understand what the companies are doing. So comparability and transparency is what people are looking for.
Yeah.
And that's what, the different countries have been pursuing, both from the Australian perspective, from the Indonesian perspective, being able to develop our capital markets and draw in that money that will then drive the economy.
Oh, excellent. But you mentioned about comparability and transparency. Those are benefits of the IFRS, right? For accountants that are probably still not adopting IFRS standards, can you give a bit more perspectives on what are the general benefits of aligning ourselves with the IFRS?
Well, I think that many countries have embraced aligning with IFRS because of what I was referring to about having global capital markets.
Correct.
And many countries want to attract investment because the investment underpins the growth. And the investment wants to go where it can be used efficiently. So from the investor side, they're looking for high quality information for the decision making. From the company side, they're looking to bring down cost of capital. And bringing down cost of capital is about the information. And I think that's why we see great support around the world for IFRS standards from things like IOSCO, the body of the securities regulators, the international body, from the World Bank, the support from G7, G20 countries. That's about all of us being together and pulling together. So countries that are still on that journey, the benefits that come from being together using the same accounting standards so the investors can go across countries and the money can move. And for Indonesia, they're a very important country within this region. I've seen in my visit, a lot of information about Indonesia having the presidency of ASEAN for this year. Indonesia is looked to as a leading country in the region. And being part of the region, the ability of the countries to all be using the same accounting standards, it takes a friction out of the investment process. There's a lot of resources that support IFRS. And so as a country becomes a full adopter of IFRS, it also means not only that the investors have that insight into what the companies are doing, the companies themselves can avail themselves of all the support that exists through the professional accounting bodies. There's many sources of support for that one accounting language. So many benefits for companies and for countries.
No, I totally agree. So speaking of which, I have good news for you. Indonesia, in fact, in December 2022, the Ikatan Akuntan Indonesia, which is the accounting standards setting in Indonesia, adopted what we call DSAK International or International Accounting Standards, right? And that represents a word-of-word translations of the IFRS literature. So I think this is a very important first step for us toward aligning ourselves. I think all this time we have adopted IFRS, but we haven't gone full board of a word-for-word translation. Any particular comment on that? Or do you think this is a welcoming step from the global perspective?
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to be here and talk about this. I think it's a really positive step for Indonesia and positive step for IFRS family. I'm really excited about it. And I think that benefits will flow. The research shows that full adoption has a benefit. It signals the seriousness of the companies that are doing it to be part of IFRS reporting, and research shows the benefits that flow. The major adoption announced in 2002 and occurring in 2005 with the European Union, there's many years now and there's a lot of research, and that research shows benefits for countries and for companies of the full adoption of the standards. And those benefits come through increased foreign investment, that's demonstrated benefit, and even research on the companies themselves. Although companies incur costs when they are first adopting, there are net benefits that can be demonstrated. So it is a really important thing that companies take the full set of standards, because that's better for investors and better for comparability, that the full set of standards are used and investors can see what the companies are doing.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is the benefits will outweigh the cost of that adoption itself, right? Because it provides the opportunity for more Indonesian companies to tap into this global market.
Yes, and there are many countries in Asia that have full adoption, so it's a very positive step for Indonesia.
Yeah.
And as I understand the proposal, it'll be a voluntary adoption initially. And we can see that there must be benefits, because we've got nearly more than 40% of the Japanese market capitalization on full IFRS standards on a voluntary basis.
Wow.
So that tells us that companies that want to source capital outside their home market can see a benefit from full adoption of IFRS.
I'm very glad to hear that. Now, those are the benefits, but of course, some people are still concerned also about probably the cost, and not so much the cost of adoption, but some people are a bit skeptical, I would say, on how fast the IASB are responding to these industry-specific issues. Let me pull an example. Indonesia, for example, a lot of our companies in Indonesia are doing transactions based on Sharia transactions. So some people are concerned that whether full alignment to IFRS can address some of these industry-specific issues, right? I mentioned Sharia just for example, right? Any particular comment on how the IASB are staying abreast of all these industry-specific?
Yes, and that's a great question. But I would like to reassure listeners that the IASB only works in consultation with national standard setters, with the professional bodies, with stakeholders globally. And we have a lot of focus and work on our relationships with different countries. So as you know, myself, I'm part of a group of people that come from the Asia-Oceania region. We have other board members that also represent the Asia-Oceania region. But all our board members are active either through specific consultation groups or directly by visiting and engaging. So, for example, you've mentioned Sharia. So Bruce McKenzie, one of my colleagues, is the chair of the Islamic Finance Consultative Group.
Oh, wow.
And they met very recently in Kuala Lumpur. And this is the opportunity for people in the region for whom these are very important transactions to consult and speak not only with the IASB directly, but also with their colleagues in other countries. Because, I mean, that's the beauty of the global language, that everyone is facing the same problem.
Yeah.
You know, when you're within a particular industry, and you can have the benefits of speaking to your colleagues. And so those stakeholder meetings are so important, and they are the bedrock of how the IFRS Foundation works. And so a number of consultative groups, but we're talking about Islamic finance in this case.
Yeah.
So there's that way that we really think that there's communication channels, there are open, and we don't just make decisions in abstract. We're really keen to hear from stakeholders and have the two-way conversations.
That is something that will be very pleasant for us and comforting for many accountants in Indonesia, right? Yeah. So the IASB is opened.
I can give another example, and this was in relation to adoption some years ago, and IAS 16, property, plant and equipment, and also the agriculture standard. And if you've been following the IASB work for some time, you'll know that under Hans Hugevorst, amendments were made in response to specific issues and requests from this region.
Correct.
So we do have a track record of showing that we are engaging, we are listening, and in this case, changes were made so that certain plants, the bearer plants, could be under property, plant and equipment and treated that way, rather than
biological
a fair value model. So that's an example of how the interaction goes.
Oh, lovely. So maybe let me remind some of the listeners here to give a context of what Professor Ann was saying. Is in this part of the world, a plantation industry is very significant, right? And so a lot of the financial reporters in the plantation industry were voicing their aspirations about a particular accounting treatment, and the IASB listened to that, and which resulted in the amendment of IAS 16 and IAS 41, if I'm mistaken, right?
I mean, the IASB has to listen to a broad range of stakeholders, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that we can just change standards for a particular group.
Yeah.
But this is an example where the new information was presented, and it was reconsidered by the board carefully, and changes were made.
Correct.
So international accounting standards are a compromise.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't always get what they want.
Yeah.
Sometimes with the standards, the people, a particular group will not necessarily be supportive, but sometimes after the standard comes, they find that on balance, there are benefits. Yeah. And I think we've seen that with some recent standards that have been difficult to develop, but benefits have come once they're embedded. So I would just encourage companies certainly to talk to us in our standard setting process and through our consultations. Yeah. But remember that we're trying to do something that, to the best of our ability, will work globally. Yeah. But we do have processes where we revisit. It's not that we're revisiting the basis, but we look at how the standard's been applied. So in post-implementation reviews, that's our time for going back and hearing from stakeholders how it's working in practice. And we're very much engaged with the one on financial instruments at the moment, getting a lot of feedback. And that's where we have the chance to say, well, how has it worked? This is what we thought. And how has it worked? And give us the feedback. And then, as appropriate, we can make adjustments. Thank you.
That's very good. So it sounds like, is it fair for me to say then, even though the IASB is headquartered in London, but it is truly a global standards, and the IASB encourages global participants to participate in this process as well?
Very, very much the case.
Okay.
Our board members come from a wide range of countries, and that will continue into the future. And our staff come from a wide range of countries. But the very important element in our work is being able to have contacts with people so that they can email or speak directly to a board member or a member of staff. And similarly, we can do it the other way.
Very good to hear that. Very good. And these days, I think we cannot have a conversation without talking about ESG, right? I think the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG topic is perhaps number one in much of the business discussion these days, right? And when we talk about, I want to talk about the EU, for example, right? The climate. I know the IASB, for those listeners, it's International Sustainability Standard Board, is developing sustainability standards. I want to ask you, how's the linkage between the sustainability reporting standards with the IFRS that is being developed by the IASB, right? What's the linkage between the two? And in particular, let me give you an example, right? In this part of the world, we are still sourcing a lot of power using conventional energy. And the government of Indonesia is making good strides and taking very progressive approach of trying to change conventional energy with renewables. But for some people, they are concerned that the current IFRS literature might result in impairment of existing assets, for example. So I wonder whether there are anything that the IASB is doing to address this linkage between sustainability reporting on one hand and IFRS.
Yes. So there's a lot going on in this space, as you said. So firstly, the IASB and the ISSB as sister boards, the Accounting Standards Board and the Sustainability Disclosure Standards Board. I think that a lot of stakeholders around the world supported the formation of the second board and put it under the IFRS Foundation to benefit from the structure and the due process. It is actually a vote of confidence in the accounting standards to say, let's put the sustainability standards under that same structure so that we, as all the external stakeholders, can rely on the organisation, the due process, the independence, the quality of the work, the consultation. So that's why people putting it together. Now, we're very excited about the release of the first two standards, S1 and S2, releasing at the end of June, so just around the corner. Now, they are the work of the new board, but the board has taken things from the IFRS literature, from the accounting standards literature. So taking things from, for those of you who are accountants, IAS 1, IAS 8, so taking things from the existing literature and using them. So concepts that are part of S1, a concept like materiality, is the same concept for the accounting standards and the disclosure standards. So there's been that type of referencing, and so in endeavouring to make sure that the sustainability standards, there's a framework, and it builds on a framework that's a framework people are familiar with from accounting standards. Behind the scenes, there's been reference to between the staff, and the staff have worked together as appropriate on things to help the big sister helping the small sister, if you will. So that's all going on. There's close cooperation between the chairs and the vice chairs of the two boards, and we're really looking forward to your comments on the ISSB agenda consultation. And one of those, there's 4 things that people are seeking input on. For the IASB agenda consultation, we had a lot of encouragement to work with the ISSB. So I'm hoping stakeholders will continue to provide that feedback and encourage the boards to work together. So that was the first part of the question. Now, the second part of the question specifically to the business of impairment and to the change that is coming in the world. So as part of our agenda consultation, we've picked up what is a narrow scope project on climate-related risk. So that's under the IASB. And climate-related risk is just a project where we'll look specifically about whether we should amend any of our accounting standards. So you might be familiar that we have some education material on this that was released, and that education material provides good guidance for companies. So companies, people that are concerned, that's your first stop. Go and have a look what's in there on our guidance on, as you're using IAS 1, the guidance on disclosure of these climate-related risks, right? Disclosure of the judgments and estimates, and also under the impairment standard. So looking at that together will give people a lot more guidance in how they should be thinking about it. So the guidance exists, but our narrow scope project will have a look and see whether we should be giving more guidance. So that might be in the form of more education material. It might be with the form of illustrative examples. But it is a narrow scope project. We're not changing the conceptual framework in this area. So as people think about what they should be disclosing going forward, that going to the existing material is the good place to start. So on that project, we will take advice from the staff of the ISSB as the experts in climate standard setting with their S2, their climate standard. So we will be taking advice from them to help us with that project.
And for that narrow scope project, are you opening yourself to receive feedbacks from the global audience as well?
Oh, most definitely, because that is our due process. So the project has been commenced. We've got that far with it. We've said we've started it, and we have our webpage going, and we keep everybody updated on our steps. But if we come to the step of wanting to make a change to any of our standards, we will do that through our normal consultation process. And our first question as standard setters that we always address is, what is the problem? What is the problem we're trying to fix? Is there some deficiency in our current literature so that people don't know what to do? And also for us, that's the question. And we always think about our whole audience, because there's the audience, there's what companies are doing and what they do in relation to their work with their auditors and their regulators.
Yeah.
So there are a number of parties involved in this, and sometimes it's an education process. So people sometimes come back to us and say, no, we think the standard is enough, because it's a principle-based arrangement of standards. We think the standard, the words are there, and it's the work of the companies, the auditors and the regulators to move to a fuller disclosure or a different sort of disclosure on a point. So we will, if we propose to make changes to the standard, we will do our consultation process. So there would be an ED, an exposure draft process, and we look forward to comments and feedback on that. And I would say that those comments that we receive in that process are seriously considered, always seriously considered. I know sometimes people get frustrated because their particular point of view hasn't held sway, but we consider, at the board table, we consider them all. The staff are very thorough about giving everyone a voice, and then we have to make the hard decisions.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I know the IASB staffs read every single letters that come in,
yes,
and summarize them and then report them to the board, right? So it's a very robust process,
yes,
of considering all the feedback.
Yeah.
Which you mentioned auditors, regulators, financial reporting preparers.
And investors. Never allowed to forget that.
And investors, of course. So there's a broad range of stakeholders, right? So what would you say about, what would you recommend people doing for these stakeholders? Apparently they are all important stakeholders that perhaps should participate, right, in this process. So what would you say to these stakeholders? Would you encourage more participation, or?
Well, I think the whole process relies on the participation. So my answer to your question has to be yes. And as Indonesia enters this new and exciting phase, it will become really important for those companies that are adopting full IFRS standards that they are heard and their experiences are heard by us. And so I do encourage all the stakeholders to be part of the process. So there's a number of ways to do that. We have consultation. So, for example, the one that we just mentioned about climate-related risk, if there are proposals for change, there'll be a consultation document, and we'd encourage people to respond either directly or through their professional associations. We also encourage feedback on that other process I talked about, the post-implementation review process. So we're currently suggesting some narrow scope changes on IFRS 9, and we look forward to feedback on those from people that are already working with that standard and have got experience with it. And the way people can also engage with us is through the interpretations committee, but there are also informal processes as well. And that means speaking with board members, speaking with staff members. All of us in the organisation are open for talking and consultation. So the formal processes, yes, meeting at us in conference events or in specific outreach events, or speaking with us directly. The whole thing about IFRS standards, the accounting standards, only works through a global consultation process. I think we have track record now. I think we can show that it does work, but we do encourage people to speak with us. So thank you.
So that's a very comforting message, right? So the IASB is actually encouraging more participation from the global participants. So
yes, and we want to hear not just from the largest of companies and the biggest of countries. To be a global success story, the world is made up of many countries, and we have about 144 countries now involved in IFRS accounting standards in a serious way. And we do want to hear from different countries and regions.
Perfect. Anything else you want to add, Ann?
I look forward to hearing about the adoption by under the new regime, and please keep in touch, and I will be watching with great interest. And I would encourage people to grasp this opportunity, which I'm so confident will bring many benefits for Indonesia, and that means for Indonesian people.
For sure.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, Ann. It's been a pleasure for us to have this conversation with you. For a pleasure for Ikatan Akuntan Indonesia to be able to host you and have this conversation. I'm very sure all the messages that you laid out are very important for our Akuntan Indonesia. So the key takeaway is IFRS do provide a global baseline that will be beneficial for all financial reporters as well as investors and stakeholders. And the IASB listening to our feedback, and they are encouraging us to participate more. Thanks a lot, Ann.
Thank you very much, Irwan, and Akuntan Indonesia. Thank you.
Baik, itulah bincang-bincang kita dengan Profesor Ann Tarca pada episode IAI Podcast kali ini. Jangan lupa untuk di-like dan subscribe acara IAI Podcast ini yang tersedia di IAI YouTube, Spotify, maupun Instagram. Sampai jumpa pada kesempatan berikutnya. IAI kuat, tumbuh, dan berkelanjutan.